Thanks, y'all. This is 3 weeks in a row when we get to talk about stories from Luke. The first one was about how we should be aware of the pain and the beauty around us and respond with gratitude. The second one last week was about how we are always welcome to come back to God. No matter what questions you have, no matter what pain you have, you're always welcome to come back. Third story here, we've been on this roll of you reminding each other what the details of the story are before we jump into it. So, who's involved in this story?
Pharisee the tax collector.
The guy who read it, he knows it, yeah. And what were they doing? Praying. And where were they praying?
Church.
Yeah, church. It was one big church. So this town, Jerusalem, really big city. Let's say probably a little bit bigger than Boulder. And in those days, you can imagine what that was like without traffic lights and all. But they have one huge church down there, and these two guys come to that temple and pray. Before we say anything about Jesus' point in this story, before we say anything about how it applies to your life, I want to dig in a little bit to who these characters are. A little bit of history, a little bit of exegesis, jumping into the text, seeing what these people are. If you don't like history, well, just read your Bible for a while, and I'll snap my fingers when it's time to come back. So, first guy, we have taxes today. Raise your hand if you really love taxes. I mean, you just love taxes. Yeah, this guy, yeah. I have no idea if the people in first century Palestine paid more or less than we do. I have no comment whether we should pay more or less than them. There's an election coming up about taxes. This ain't the place or the time, but I do know that when we think of sales tax and income tax and property tax and all those other things, and when we think of government people, the whole army of people who collect that and kind of manage our taxes, those images have nothing to do with this tax collector that we just read about in this story. Back in Jesus' day, this is how taxes happened. It's 5 steps. 1, Rome, kind of the Washington, D.C., Rome would contract out the process of tax collection. They would sell that opportunity to people to collect taxes. 2, some rich guy, it was always a rich guy, would pay for the right to collect some certain amount of taxes for a certain region. Usually the tax collector was a foreigner who would come into a new region. Maybe it was a failed businessman from Rome and he had some connections, and so he had one new start so he could make it back. In this story, it seems like this tax collector was a local. That's why he went to the temple. If he was from Rome, he wouldn't have gone into the temple. He would have been on the edges. So in this case, he's probably local. 3, that guy, whoever he is, would collect taxes directly from every family, from every person in the region, whenever he wanted, however he wanted. There were no votes. There were no April 15ths. There were no forms or formulas for you to see. Romans actually had a lot of forms and formulas, but you didn't get to see them. There was no oversight. There was plenty of begging. There was plenty of kind of light violence. Think about loan sharks rather than kind of mafioso. People with taxes were more scared than angry. When they talked about their taxes, it wasn't as though this is unfair. It was this is unfair. They're beating me. So they often fell prey to the tax collector who would come and say, "You owe $100," and the people would say, "I only have 60." And so the tax collector would say, "I'll lend you 40." And you see how we're rolling. You see why now people would buy into this process. So step 4, that guy would send back to Rome exactly the amount that Rome asked for. And step 5, everything else went in his pocket. Whatever he collected, maybe more than he was supposed to, whatever he could leverage out of people, went right back into his pocket. So being a tax collector was a really good deal if you had the stomach for it. Now we might have this image you see today of tax collectors as in some building, in some agency, some just accountant as it is, who are collecting our taxes and adding it up on spreadsheets and everything. But you have to scratch those images. They're not just regular people. They aren't just nice people. In Jesus' day, taxes were personal and painful and dangerous and life-threatening all the time. And some collectors, I'm sure they were worse than others, but it is just simply inconceivable to imagine an honest tax collector in those days. Without fail, every one of them took advantage of their power and abused their neighbors. And unless you were kind of a scumbag like them, you just could not possibly have patience for these guys. Inconceivable. Second person in this story. You hear all kinds of stories about Jesus being mad at Pharisees. Scrap that for a second. Just go with blank slate. Let's just talk about what a Pharisee was, who people saw a Pharisee as. When Jesus grew up, there were these two main Jewish political parties, religious parties, denominations, whatever they might be called. One was called the Sadducees. One was called the Pharisees. Now, there were also a couple of small groups, the Essenes. They were kind of a leave-me-alone spirituality hippie type. They would fit in Nederland. And then there was another group called the Zealots that would carry around these special swords, and they wanted to revolt against Rome and take back their land, which, we have that kind of feeling in the mountains too. So you have these two small groups, but the really big groups that mattered the most to that society were the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And if I put myself, to be honest, back into those times, I wish I could be an Essene. I wish I could go sit on a mountain and read a book and have spiritual thoughts. And part of me wishes I could be a zealot. I mean, I've had that image of defending justice with that one holy punch, or a stern talking to, and really fixing the world. And sometimes we have our moments of either of those. But if I'm going to be honest, I would have been a Pharisee. If those were the options, I would have been a Pharisee. Here's why. Sadducees tended to be really, really literalist and stern about the Hebrew Bible. Pharisees tended to be more progressive in their interpretation, and they paid attention to what people would say about the Bible and how that affected their lives today. And so progressive, that's what it is. Sadducees held up priests as very powerful and as holy people. Pharisees wanted to open things up to everybody, faith to all people. Sadducees tended to be rich. Pharisees tended to be comfortable, but they cared about the poor. And there's lots and lots of stories in ancient Jewish religion where Pharisees were helping out the poor. Sadducees tended to think that we are totally free to do whatever we want, and it's up to us to meet God's standards. As opposed to Pharisees who thought, well, yeah, we have free will, but God seems to have either knows about what's going to happen or somehow controls some end game, which sounds a little bit like Calvin, who started a little church we call Presbyterian. So in those kind of ways, I'd be more Pharisee than Sadducee. You've probably heard of at least one Pharisee in the world. Most colleges have this thing called a Hillel house. You've seen these or you've heard of these. Hillel house. It's a campus ministry for Jewish students. Hillel was a Pharisaic Jew who died only about 20 years before Jesus. He once got into an argument. He got into a lot of arguments. But he once got into one with a Sadducee, and the Sadducee said, he challenged Hillel. He said, summarize your point of being faithful. Summarize the Jewish kind of faith all at once. And this is what Hillel said. That which is hateful to you, don't do it to your friend. That's the whole Hebrew Bible. The rest is explanation. So go, study it. Which sounds a lot like Jesus when someone said, Jesus summarized the greatest commandment. Doesn't that sound the same? So Pharisees, in this kind of presentation, they don't sound that bad, do they? I can make it kind of an argument that these are decent guys. The bad thing is, though, they like to argue. They thought that was a good value of getting things just precise. And we all like being right. And some of us really like proving that we're right. Some of us in here, we grew up in families where it's just natural and just ubiquitous to argue all the time. So we all know people who just need to be right, just for the sake of being right, and it's more important to them to be right than it is to care about you. I see people laughing with their mates here. There must be stories behind some of that. So again, just a confession of my own, but there have been times in my life where that would draw me even more to being a Pharisee. I like being right. And some of you too do also. So those are our characters. Good and bad. They're mixed up here, but we've got those guys and we've got Jesus. And you know that Jesus often stood up for the tax collector. Strangely. It's as though he thought maybe there's some hope that this jerk might be able to heal. It's as though he thought maybe he should be on the side of the people who are most disliked in the world. And some of you know that Jesus, in many, many places, just rails against the Pharisees. Just gets so angry at them. He's always supporting widows. He has nothing but good things to say about orphans. He loves farmers. He loves people who are sick. He loves all kinds of regular people. But when it comes to the Pharisees, almost every time he's in their presence, he is using some serious language. It borders on, well, I don't know. So, every time he uses the word hell, almost every time he uses the word hell in the Bible, he's pointing at someone who's a leader of a church, not someone who's just in a church. Kind of interesting. Never threatening you with hell. 13 out of the 16 times the word shows up in the Bible, he's pointing to people like his disciples and people like the Pharisees. So, point all that. In this time, if a Pharisee and a tax collector walked into the temple, everyone would have looked at the Pharisee and said, that's the good guy. He's generous, he's prayerful, he takes part in his church, all good things. Every one of them would look at the tax collector and think he's terrible. Greedy, abusive, dangerous. And while most people have that image, it should be no surprise that Jesus takes that and flips it completely upside down. So that's who we're talking about. Those are the people in this story. Now, what does this story mean for us? When Jesus turns those characters upside down, what does it tell us about God's grace? And most importantly, how we're supposed to respond to God's grace? If we think there's anything special about Jesus enough that we might want to start following him, what's this story about? And some would say that this passage is being preached in just hundreds of thousands of churches today. Millions of people are hearing it. And some of the sermons say the point is, be sincere in your prayers, which is there. That's part of the message. Some are saying, be humble about who you are. And that's definitely there. That's part of the message. Some would say, admit your mistakes to God. Great. So a friend of mine down in southern part of Colorado, he likes that last verse of that exalting and humbling, flippant thing. And he always looks at Jesus as this countercultural image. So he found this prayer, posted it on Facebook. Says it's from a 7-year-old. I don't know, it's a cool prayer. He says, Dear God, 7-year-old says, Dear God, please help the poor people get rich and the rich people get poor so they know what it feels like. And then, God, let everyone switch back to medium and let everyone have the same amount of food and money. Amen. I don't know if a 7-year-old wrote that. It's pretty darn clever. Jesus might have liked it. But it's probably not exactly what the exalting and humbling thing is doing. But in some churches, that's the message you're going to hear today. I have been trying, because Jesus always has a deeper message, I have been trying to just glean through and dig out and reach down deep and find something different, something deeper here. What kind of guidance is hiding in this passage? I think, this is where I've landed, I think the point of this story, when I read between the lines, is to remind us in two very different ways that when you respond to God's grace and follow Jesus, it's not all about you. When you respond to God's grace and to follow Jesus, it's not all about you. It's not about your money, even though these guys are rich. It's not about success, even though they're successful. It's not about achievement or your brilliance or your beauty or your cleverness or the saccharine values that we see on TV. It's not about any of the values that America holds up as status symbols. I think that when we mix up these characters and respond to God's grace, it's not even about being good. Whatever that means. Whatever it means to be good. It's not about that. I think what Jesus is pointing to, two things. On one hand, we are way more responsible for causing pain in the world than we think we are. And on the other hand, we deserve way less credit for doing good than we think we should. So on the one hand, that's a lot to unpack. On the one hand, you've got this tax collector. I don't think he's just confessing his greed and his theft. I don't think he's just saying, God, I'm sorry for stealing money. I sense something deeper and wider in his confession. He's talking to God in very vague, open terms. He's not confessing to an individual or about an individual. And I think Jesus is using him to remind us that all of our actions, the subtle ones, the habits, the ones we make choices are, no matter how intentional, no matter how small, all our actions affect many people, sometimes, oftentimes, in kind of bad ways. And no matter how good or bad we are, whatever that means, we're just all stuck in these systems of oppression and injustice. So what does that mean, systems of oppression and injustice? Sometimes I can point to a problem and say it's her fault. She did it, or they did it over there. And that's moral behavior or something. There are other times when we can't really point to any one person or group of people because we're all just involved. We're just stuck in this mess of racism or any of the isms that might be out there. It's not your fault that driving and eating and buying clothes almost always hurts someone down the line. It's not your fault that the world is just full of consequences. But whenever we take part in these sorts of things, we're doing things that cause pain to someone else. And it's so easy to feel helpless. It's so easy to feel disengaged from how our eating a tomato affects someone in Florida. But if we want to take a step towards something holy, something more holy than just morality, if we want to follow Jesus toward discipleship, I think the tax collector reminds us of how responsible we are in our lives for all things, for all we do. Second, the Pharisee. What does the Pharisee show us? What annoys me about this guy is not his kind of self-proclamation, but it's how he gives himself credit. I can't argue with his habits or his actions, his fasting, his prayers. Those are great things. But I think that Jesus uses this Pharisee here to show us that anyone with integrity should give credit to all the people and all of God's holy direction that brings them to the good things that they do. It's not bad to have talents and success. It's not bad to point to those talents or success when it's a reflection of God, but to recognize that all you have comes from God. All you are is shaped by people who came before you. America is the culture more than any in the world that loves to hold up the individual. I'm a self-made man. I pulled myself up by my bootstraps. I earned it all with hard work. And that's bull. Can you imagine like Mother Teresa saying, I'm just so smart. I figured out how to really fix things. Or Billy Graham saying, I am such a good preacher. Talk to 1 billion people. It's all my words. Martin Luther King. I shall overcome with hard work. Yeah, it's Martin Luther King's hard work. That's what it is. It's not God's direction or his father who taught him how to preach. It's silly. The people we are drawn to are the people who acknowledge that their lives were shaped by other great people and by God's direction. In our lives, many of you have had just rough childhoods. Many of you have had rough adulthoods. Many of you are in rough situations right now, and none of us have made it through any of those things on our own. We've worked hard, but every one of us has learned from other people. Every one of us has been supported by other people, and every one of us has someone to appreciate and someone to thank for getting to this place. So, last week we had a fashion lesson. We get another fashion lesson today. This sweater, right here, I want you to put it on. You can see it's pretty big. This is knit by Mary Black. Hand knit by Mary Black, right there. Mary Black is my grandmother. My grandma made this sweater for me. It's a little big for me. She made it for me when I was 8. Yeah, 28 years ago this week, she doesn't know anything about sizes, but she made it for me out of love. I have barely had any opportunity to hang out with Grandma Black. I hear, to be honest, we're all mixed. I hear she was really mean to my dad and to my aunts. The whole family has all kinds of stories. They're perfectly consistent that when she was a mom, she was just mean. But my experience was really different. I visited her twice as a kid in New Jersey. She has a collection of salt and pepper shakers, and by collection, I mean 2,000 or 3,000 sets of salt and pepper shakers. Her basement is just loaded with these things, and so I would send her that every Christmas, a salt and pepper shaker. She has the staircase with at least 1,000 pictures of grandkids and great-grandkids and second cousins and everything. Her house is just filled with pictures and salt and pepper shakers. Somehow, between collecting all that, she found time every birthday and every Christmas to write me a card with that little check. Sometimes they had $10. This continued till I was like 30. And it was just so sweet. I mean, there's a lot of her that's a very grandmotherly. She really rocked Grandma. I heard on Wednesday that Grandma Black is moving to hospice. She has moved to hospice. She's off the tubes. She's off the medicines. Any day now, she's going to pass. Any day. So I wanted to tell you about how she's affected me, how she's shaped, even in these few little times I've met her. The only third time I've ever really hung out with her was on the night of the millennium, the night before the millennium. I was driving up to New York City. Me and a buddy were going to go just blow it out as big as it could be. I mean, it's December 30th, 1999. We're going to New York City. We have a friend. We're going to stay in Hoboken. But his plane was late. And so he wasn't going to be in that night. We were stranded, and it was cold, and it was getting late, and I didn't know what to do. So I called my grandma. I'm 22 years old. I call her up, first time probably ever on the phone. And she said, sure, come on over. So we arrived, these two young guys, ready to just have a blast. And my friend Sid, she's showing him her salt and pepper shakers. And lo and behold, this 75-year-old woman hiding in the salt and pepper shakers is a kegerator. So we drank beer till 2 in the morning with her, which is probably why her sweaters can't ever get the right size. We woke up in the morning to this huge breakfast. I mean, bigger than the senior pancake brunch. And when we left, she gave us 12 dozen cookies. That's a gross. Like, the only things you do with a gross are bottle rockets. But this is like a gross of cookies. And I won't tell you anything that happened after that, because it was the millennium and it was fun. But I will tell you that if there's anything in me that's flexible or generous or welcoming, if there's any of that in me, some small part came from her. Whether it's nature, whether it's nurture, I don't care. But whatever it is in me that echoes her spirit, I want to give her thanks. It would be foolish, it would be insensitive to say to God and say to the world that any of my good actions just came from me. Everything we have comes from God, and everything we are is shaped by other people. And humility isn't even a big enough word for this kind of an idea. But I think Jesus uses the Pharisee in this story to remind us to recognize how our family and how our community shapes who we are. It's not about you. It's about the people who made you who you are. So take a minute. Turn to a neighbor. Tell them something you appreciate about yourself and where it came from. You got a minute. God shines a light in you somewhere. Who is it that tuned that for you? Take a minute. We don't learn from the Pharisee to hide the good things about us. We learn here, I think, to give credit to God and to give credit to the people who God puts on your path. And from the tax collector, again, just to sum, again, the word for that isn't quite humility, but when we step toward holiness, we make ourselves aware of how connected we are to everything and everyone in the world. It's not about you or what you have or what you can do. It's about us. It's about how our actions impact each other. There's a quote on the front of your bulletin from a friend of mine, David Lamott. The side note might be scandalous, but it's kind of fun there. It says something very nicely. It's let's read it all together. 1, 2, 3, read.
You're changing the world whether you like it or not.
And that is not a challenge. That is not an inspiration. It's just a fact that we are in this thing together. It's not about you. It's about us, whether you like it or not. The way I explained this to my teenagers this summer, they complained about the problems of the world, and it's not their fault. It's not their fault. And I'd say, well, no, but we all contribute to those problems. And they would argue, no, I don't contribute to that problem over there. And I would argue back, well, no, it's not an issue of your actions and that problem being like all lined up together. It's a web of all of us together taking part in the way the world is. And they would complain, well, it's not their fault that the world is set up that way. I'd say, oh, you're right. It's It's not. And this is how I've responded. I've only said 3 clever things in my life that I've invented all on my own. This is one of them, so pay attention. I said, kids, it's not your fault that it is your fault. It's not your fault that it is your fault. And we live in a world where our actions, our most subtle habits, have such an impact on people's lives. And when those impacts cause pain in the world, Jesus invites us to take a step of penitent confession. And maybe when you acknowledge your responsibility in the world for the way you use water, it'll change how you brush your teeth. And maybe that'll affect climate patterns somewhere down the line, or maybe it'll affect just your own heart and how you respond to the world. Or when you accept responsibility for the way you shop, you buy different produce, and eventually someone's wages somewhere down the line become fairer. Or when you think the pastor's preached too long, but you accept responsibility because you listened really well today, he's going to realize it and shorten his sermon next week. So friends, that's the third step of following Jesus, according to Luke. Next week we get another one. But the third step, becoming more holy, is coming to grips with the fact that it's not about you. It's about a huge community of us. And let us sing together as a huge community of us.